All right, all right. Right. So, welcome to this edition of Cronkite's Must See Monday. We've had some really insightful conversations in this space in recent months about journalism, diversity, and authenticity. And tonight, we're going to continue that conversation with two trailblazing journalists who've been bright lights in our field when it comes to identity, experience, and better storytelling that benefit our global community. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our guest speakers tonight. We're so happy that they could join us here for this special edition of Must See Monday. So you all know her, but she is Soledad O'Brien, who is an award-winning documentarian, journalist, speaker, author, and philanthropist who founded Soledad O'Brien Productions, a multi-platform media production company dedicated to telling empowering and authentic stories on a wide range of social issues. She anchors and produces the Hearst TV political magazine show, Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien, and is a correspondent with HBO's Real Sports. Now, Soledad is a thought leader. She has, over 1 million Twitter followers and has had national impact through her speeches, her numerous documentaries, and her presence on the op-ed pages of platforms like the New York Times and Huffington Post. She's anchored shows on CNN, MSNBC, NBC, and she's reported for Fox, A&E, Oxygen, National Geographic, the PBS NewsHour, WebMD, and Al Jazeera America, among other platforms. And her work has been recognized over the years with 3 Emmy Awards, twice with the George Foster Peabody Award, and 3 times with the Gracie Award, which honors women in media. She's twice received the Cine Award for her work with documentary filmmaking, and also the Alfred I. DuPont Award. Welcome, Soledad.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
An award along with her is Rose Arce, who is the executive producer for Soledad O'Brien Productions. Now, she's also a 3-time Emmy Award-winning journalist and a filmmaker who spent 15 years covering breaking news and producing documentaries for CNN. She began her TV career at CBS News, but before that, she was a print reporter, most recently with New York's Newsday, where she shared the Pulitzer Prize with her colleagues for breaking news coverage. She's taught as an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of Journalism, Rutgers College, and the CUNY Journalism School. She's the author of 3 books, 2 co-authored with Soledad, and is a past board member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association. Welcome, Rose. Are you muted there, Rose?
I said thank you.
Okay, great. So tonight we're going to talk about the whole idea of identity, experience, and better storytelling. And I want to, if you've not watched Matter of Fact, is something that you definitely should take a look at, because I think the way they approach storytelling there is something that we can all learn from, and especially those people who are going into broadcast journalism. I want to start with last summer. It was a really tough year for African Americans and for white people of goodwill and for a good part of the country. So in the wake of George Floyd's killing, along with Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others, many news outlets tried to make some sense of what was happening and why was it that George Floyd's murder in particular struck a chord with so many people from around the country and the world. And today, of course, was the start of the trial for the police officer charged with killing George Floyd. And as I watched it this morning, I was really sort of struck when I listened to civil rights attorney Ben Crump sort of summing up the crime against George Floyd last May. And I felt, and I was struck at how much trauma that I was feeling at that moment this morning, hearing it again, replaying what happened on May 24th and all the aftermath. And it reminded me, as I was preparing for this, of the piece that you did for Matter of Fact on generational trauma. And in a few moments, we're going to play that clip where you tried to get at how so many people in this country perhaps don't understand how much racism and racial violence against African Americans creates this generational trauma. And I want to play that clip and then talk about your approach and why you chose to tell this story that way right after that clip.
At 22 years old, Bakari Sellers made history as the youngest elected official in the South Carolina state legislature and the youngest Black elected official in the country. Well, now he's a political commentator, lawyer, and author at the ripe old age of 35. But his new memoir, My Vanishing Country, begins with a story years before he was born. The 1968 Orangeburg Massacre at South Carolina State University, a historically Black college. Highway patrolmen opened fire on civil rights protesters who wanted to desegregate a bowling alley. They killed 3 people, wounded dozens more. One of the wounded was Cleveland Sellers, Bakari's father. He was also sentenced to a year in prison, accused of inciting a riot. He was pardoned decades later. I spoke to Bakari earlier about why he says that day, 16 years before his birth, is the most important day of his life. Bakari Sellers, so nice to talk to you. We've been on panels and had lots of conversations over the years, but never this conversation. And you talk about your dad's story as the most important in your life. Why?
On that night in justice, it left mothers without their sons. It left the pages of this country's history stained red with blood. And it left my sister born without her father. My sister was actually born while my father was in prison. And so my frame of reference and the way that I evaluate things socially, culturally, and politically is a son of the movement. And that trauma from the Orangeburg Massacre all the way through the Charleston Massacre, it bookends my life. But I think it highlights the pain and trauma of being Black in America.
You talk about that trauma, not just personally, but how that trauma actually affects lots of Black men, Black women, Black families, their children. I think people don't necessarily understand how trauma kind of moves through generations. Can you explain that?
Yes, and I think most white folk actually look at race through the lens of their lifetime. And one of the things I try to do in My Vanishing Country, and the way that I've learned about looking at race, is through the context and contours of history. My father got involved in the movement because of Emmett Till in 1955. So you think about Emmett Till and Jimmy Lee Jackson, you think about Medgar Evers, the 4 little girls in the 16th Street Baptist Church, and you fast forward and you have Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, you have George Floyd. And I think that the biggest consternation that I have in my heart is that this is becoming a cycle in Black America, that we are in a perpetual stage of grief. And I am 35 and my father's 75. And we have many of the same shared experiences.
Powerful. Soledad and Rose, Soledad, let's start with you. Why did you approach telling the story of George Floyd through the eyes of what Bakari was talking about in this whole idea of generational trauma?
One of the reasons I've really liked working on Matter of Fact is we don't have to do it the way everybody else does it. Because I think you're right. I think the way everyone else does it is what we call the TikTok. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. We kind of march everybody through. I know because I've done it many times. But Matter of Fact, when we started thinking about what the show would really be, I joined 1 season in and we really started rethinking. You know, we couldn't really have a lot of elected officials on because we pre-taped the show. We're a magazine show. And so especially under a Trump administration where things would change so fast and the news of the day would kind of flip and move and shift, what seemed like a problem to me, we can't really cover this breaking news, actually ended up being, I think, an advantage. Like, we do the story we're doing, no matter what. And that meant that we could think about what's our point of view. They're all going to cover this thing over here. So how do we want to do it? How do we do it differently? And having that kind of luxury and having an entire team built around this idea of like, we actually don't want to do it the way everybody else does it. Our strength is that we don't do it the way everybody else does it. I think it allowed us to just think about points of view and to talk about issues that were relevant in the moment, but from a very different perspective or just coming from a different take. And so we could be additive to, we're a syndicated show. So other people are watching Meet the Press or Face the Nation or whatever they're watching to get their political news. And then we come on to give some context. And I think that allowed us to say, well, we want to add value. We're not just going to repeat what you've just heard over the local news, then you clicked on the national news, and now we're not going to be the third iteration of what you now already know. We're going to bring something different. And I think what we've seen in our ratings has been that philosophy really works. Again, we thought it was kind of a bug when we started, like, oh my gosh, the president's waking up in the morning and breaking news every single day, and we can't cover it live. We're not a live show, but it ended up allowing us to say things like, so what is gerrymandering? So when people are sworn into office, what are they actually swearing to? And I think we got a lot of credit for informing and giving context to these conversations that were happening. And we knew that there was tremendous value in that.
The only thing I'd add to that is that you talk about generational trauma. And the other thing that's generational is the way reporters cover stories. One thing that hasn't changed from generation to generation is that when a Black person dies, the newsroom says, well, what do white people think about that? And then they look at it through the lens of the white community. And they have in their head this idea of the reader or the viewer, and that person is likely white. And they're likely sort of middle-aged and maybe have a kid or two and live in a house someplace that they own. And it's like, well, how does it affect this person, right? And the thing that I think has to break in our profession is this lens that we look at things through. We have to ask ourselves, well, what about the African-American people out there that have watched somebody from their own community, murdered on the street? What about the history behind this? What about the context that you can give as far as how different communities view this?
And with the show, how much did you have to push that? Did people get it when you started to talk about telling those stories in that way? And
yeah, when they recruited,
was it even for you to
when they recruited me, when they recruited me for the show, they said, the tagline for the show is stories as diverse as America herself. And then they said, so we like to track. We want to make sure that everyone we're putting on the air, that we're really balanced when it comes to diversity. And so we have a spreadsheet of everyone who appears on the air so that we can say, have we had enough Black female scientists on? Who are we using when it comes to economists? We can actually track it all. So yeah, I didn't have to convince anybody because the entire, so it's very odd because Rose and I have worked together for a long time. That kind of thing just doesn't happen. I think the entire genesis of the show was that we wanted to appeal to a more diverse audience, or an audience that wanted to see the world as it actually is. And so, no, I didn't have to convince anybody. Sometimes we do have to, everybody has to pitch something and then you're convincing because you love something and somebody else is like, oh, I think that's boring. I wouldn't want to do it. But in terms of a different perspective, never has been a problem to sort of have a point of view that challenges, again, because we're additive. I think that where you would be in big trouble is if you walked in and said, listen, I know that the local's going to do this, and I know that the network's going to do this, so I think we should do the same thing. I mean, then you'd be laughed out of the room completely. Absolutely.
That's definitely a good approach there. Both of you have been in this game, in the journalism game, for many, many years. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about, you did all this great work at CNN, most notably, Black in America and Latino in America. And, you created Soledad O'Brien production platform. And I wanted to understand why you felt that was necessary. And then in a few more minutes, I want to play a clip from a listening tour that you conducted, that you talked about trying to create this unique social experiment on bias, and really wanting people to be authentic and to talk about what it means to them. So if you could talk a little bit about, your thinking in creating your own production platform, and again, going to this clip once we play it, how did you come up with this idea of talking about bias? So maybe we can just go ahead and play that clip first, and then we'll come back and talk about just your mindset in creating your own production, and also how you did this particular show on bias.
Here we will have real and tough conversations about race and social justice issues, beginning with bias. We're going to the root of the challenge we face, uncovering the hidden prejudice that shapes what we see and think and do. But let's start at the beginning. Meet Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, the author of the book called Biased.
That association between Blackness and crime made its way into the mind of my 5-year-old, and it makes its way into all of our minds.
Hi, I'm Matan Thomas, a former NBA player, now author, motivational speaker, activist, poet. One time I was here playing with the Washington Wizards, and I was on my way to a teammate's house who lived in Virginia. So I'm driving and I'm looking for his house. The police stopped me and they said, are you lost? Can we help? And I was like, no, I'm just, looking for a house. And they said, okay, well, we have to know, what are you doing in this neighborhood?
To take a closer look at the role bias plays in our everyday lives, we invited 7 people from around the country to participate in a unique social experience. Using viral video.
That was really interesting. So what was your thought process there? And just curious about how that one was received and if people talked about it online a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. And maybe I'll start with why I decided to start a production company, because that a little bit predates that. Really, I had worked at NBC News and MSNBC and CNN for 20-something years. And when the opportunity came to start my own thing, I felt like I could go 2 ways. One, I could stay on where I was, which would be a job where I would be filling in and kind of doing that, or I could sort of strike out on my own and take all the experience that I had and do the stories that I wanted to do. I remember once covering an anniversary story of John Benet Ramsey's death. And I was in a line of about probably 60 reporters. We all they wouldn't let us close. So we were all up against a space, next to each other. And I remember thinking it is insane that I'm here. And I can't remember what I was missing at home, someone's birthday or some parent teacher thing, but literally being I am here and this is not the kind of stuff that I want to do here on a story that has 59 other people covering it. This is just up to me, not how I'd want to spend my time. And so when I had the opportunity to start my own production company, it was a really steep climb, a very sharp learning curve. But I knew that 1, I'd be able to pitch the things that I wanted to work on. And number 2, that I'd be able to work with the people I wanted to work with, that I could just, strike out and say, hey, I'm interested in doing this. Do you want to join me? And 99% of the time, people would say, yeah, I do. So it's been a really great experience. That brings us to the listening tour. When I was asked by Hearst to come up and create, co-produce this listening tour, one of the things that we wanted to do was to sort of tackle this idea about bias. The one we just finished is a one that looks at who's an American citizen. It's how identity shapes how you feel and also how you're perceived as an American citizen. Who's a real American, and why can some people just never be real Americans no matter how hard they try. But for bias, one of the reasons we talked to Eitan was because it was such a classic story that I think Black people had heard and experienced a zillion times, right? Here's a guy just giving you the daily experience of what it's like to be stopped and just assume that you do not belong here. Doesn't matter that he made a whole bunch of money as a professional NBA player, that he's a poet, that he's published, that he's blah, 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 right? None of that is relevant. All that matters is he's a Black dude who's a big dude and they're afraid and they feel well, he doesn't deserve to be here. And so we are able to tell him that he doesn't deserve to be here. He has to prove to us that he is deserving to be in this neighborhood. And I think that's such a classic and typical experience that we wanted to kind of dig into that with him because I think it got into this idea that so much bias is so commonplace for Black men in this case. And there are so many of his white counterparts who never think about it ever. They never, ever, they go through days, never, ever having a sense of I'm in a spot where I might not belong, where my existence might be challenged. And I think we wanted to open people's eyes to these conversations about bias that are often not had very honestly, because I think white people are worried about, well, if I say something, I'm going to be considered racist, and Black people are exhausted from having this conversation. They don't want to talk about it either. And I often find that Asian people, Native people are like, I'm out. I don't need to be in this conversation. So nobody really wants to kind of dig into the toughness of the conversation. So that's really why we decided to do the listening tour.
Mm-hmm. All right. And Rose, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you put that together. How did you pick the variety of people that appeared on that listening show and that we heard from?
And maybe Rose add the one that the current one we've done as well, since Rose saw sort of all the work behind the scenes on the current one about a citizenship and being an American.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that is frankly easy about these listening tours is that so little reporting of this type is done out there. So you have this big universe of people from which to choose from, and this big universe of stories that you can choose from. And part of what we're doing is sort of breaking from the mold that the television special has. One thing I should add to give sort of context to both Soledad's departure from CNN and the inauguration of the shows and the specials is that this happened during a period of time when media itself changed dramatically, in that we went from having an awful lot of reporting, at least sort of breaking news reporting in this rapid fire segments, to a time of very little reporting and a lot of talking. So there is a huge void to fill, and particularly when it comes to race reporting, there's an enormous lack of representation of voices and of factual information from which to build a conversation. So I think that's one of the things that the listening tour tries to do, is it tries to give you enough information that you can have an intelligent conversation and add voices to the conversation that you wouldn't hear on, so-called other TV. I don't want to call them mainstream TV because I think we're mainstream TV.
For sure. And that sort of brings up another question I wanted to ask you. And that is what strikes me a lot of times is the media always seems to be surprised by, things that happen when it comes to bias or racism or racial attacks. And you saw that, I think during the border crisis, all of a sudden there was a lot of reporting on Latino people and Hispanic conditions and all of this. And now you're seeing it kind of like with the anti-Asian sentiment in this country. And it just seems to be a surprise. But when you go back, and if you know anything about American history, that this has been going on for a long time. I mean, whether it was the internment of Japanese Americans in the 1940s, I remember growing up in Detroit and, in the early 80s, and Vincent Chin was a Chinese American who was beaten to death because two white male factory workers thought he was Japanese and wanted to get back for the Japanese, whooping Detroit's butt when it came to automobile production. So why is it, do you think, that there's always this reporting from a sense of surprise? Oh, wow, there's anti-Asian sentiment in America. Oh, there's anti-Arabic sentiment in America. It's a cycle. And just wanted you to weigh in on that. And how do we break it? How do we just be better journalists when it comes to telling this story?
Yeah, I think it comes with a sense of surprise, because I think there's actually surprise. I think, when we did this, how to be an American, examining identity and citizenship, we talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act. By the way, this was all produced before the most recent horrific crimes against Asian Americans. And we talked about the internment of Japanese and the man really who sort of led the litigation, the fight against that legally. So I think that you have to sort of tell those stories by going into history and giving context to these stories. And sometimes the coverage is so ahistorical, right? It's literally what we see at the end of our noses, that you just don't add any, you're not really a student of kind of what's been happening. So I think they're surprised because, again, I think most newsrooms are led by white dudes. And I think that their take and their point of view is the default de facto point of view. And so everybody is surprised when they realize, just like my surprise when I realized that everybody didn't have black beans at Thanksgiving. I was like, what? Like, no one ever told me. I mean, it's a similar thing. And I remember thinking when the George Floyd video came over social media and being so nervous about retweeting it, right? Because I knew it would be so traumatizing to some people. On the other hand, I knew for other people, it would just open their eyes that they'd never seen anything like that. And the number of people who said to me, like, I just can't believe this. And I thought, okay, well, I've done some documentaries on this and I've been reporting it for a while. You know, like this has existed. It's just you haven't felt like it mattered to you. You were the one who sort of failed to pick up on it. So I think it's a surprise because I think it's a surprise.
Yeah, and I think that diversity and a lack of diversity in newsrooms is just a tragedy of American journalism. It has meant that we have, in many ways, reported a lie about who the American public is. And you talk about bias attacks against Asian Americans. I was trying to think to myself, if I could count the number of Asian Americans that have been in all the cumulative newsrooms where I have worked, and there are maybe 4 total. And, so there wouldn't be anybody in the room to speak up and say, hey, by the way, my history has internment in it. My history has murder in it. My history has, et cetera, lynching in it. There's just nobody that would speak up. And to the extent that there are people of color in the newsroom, they're often young because the industry is always saying, okay, this is the year we're going to do this. And they hire a bunch of interns and they have everybody at this sort of low level. So they're sort of disempowered, or they're new to the profession and they don't really want to speak up too much because they're worried about losing their jobs, or they're trying very hard to fit in. So they buy into this idea that the viewership and the readership out there is white and that there's a certain kind of ideal person out there that you're broadcasting to.
Yeah. Well, we definitely want to open it up to some of our students in a few moments to ask them questions. But while they're kind of getting their thoughts together, one of the things that comes up a lot here at the Walter Cronkite School is how can young people, to your point, Rose, how can young people be effective? There are no Soledad O'Brien, at least not yet, but in those first jobs and those first internships and that first opportunity to make their mark, how can they be authentic without maybe rocking the boat or feeling afraid to speak up or to, tell those authentic stories in a way that will help their career as opposed to maybe hindering their career? What advice would you have for them, Rose and Soledad, with that? You're in a small town, you're out in, in the middle of America, far away from maybe a more diverse community. Should you speak up, and how do you do it effectively?
I'll start if you want. I think my first advice would be you're there to learn at the very early stages of your job. You're actually there certainly to add some value, but mostly to get a lot out of an organization that is probably underpaying you by a ton, right? So I would say every day get in there and walk away with, what did I learn today? How am I going to be better so that in 1 year, I can take all that I've gotten and go someplace else, someplace better. My niece was a reporter in Youngstown, Ohio. And she used to pitch all the time stories about Black people. Well, guess what? The station at Youngstown, Ohio had no interest, none. And I used to say, why are you banging your head up against the wall? Like, focus on getting better at the job. They've made it very clear they're not interested in these stories. So then do your job, focus on learning all these skills. You have a lot to learn. And then go to a place where you can say, boy, I have a treasure trove of stories that I couldn't tell the last place I was in. And they're well reported and they're really good. And I can add a lot of value to your team. There's a lot of fun in going to places where people really want, you to add value. And I think when you're young, it's a mistake to start off and being critical or trying to think that you can direct newsroom coverage. I think you can occasionally speak up and say, if someone asks you, what do you think of this story? Who would you talk to? I think there's opportunity sometimes, especially when you're entry level. But I do think it's a real challenge for young people who haven't gotten all the skills yet. They just won't be taken as seriously. And I would always argue for do the work first, and then take that and go someplace else and pitch things as they come, but understand that those pitches might be utterly dismissed. They might be dismissed because you're young and new. They might be dismissed because people just don't want to do stories on the things that matter to you. One of the greatest things I ever learned was you can have a really valuable experience and not everybody loves you. Right. And so really, like, you don't have to be teacher's pet. You don't have to have every day being a home run in an environment to walk away after 2 years and say, whew, that was the greatest learning experience of my life. I met some people who are great writers. I learned how to do live shots. I became a solid storyteller. I would never want to live in that town. I would never want to work there again. But boy, I walked away, and with all these great things, I was able to leverage my way into the next job. And I think it's really important to think about that versus in this place right here, am I getting to say all that I want to say?
Right.
Yeah, and I'd say that, go ahead. Oh,
no, I was just going to say, Rose, if you could add on to it, and
sure.
and isn't there a bottom line that you could appeal to? That if there are 2 stations in town, can you appeal to their bottom line? Like, look, we can get the Black people or the brown people to watch your station more if you would just.
Sure. Eventually, I think you can make a business case for diversity, but I think early in your career, if we're talking about early, you're still trying to get them to even notice you. And I think that people walk into the newsroom with a certain amount of clout. If it's on air, it's called gravitas. If you're a writer, it's called, influence or whatever. And you build on that, right? And so a young, say, white guy who went to Harvard walks in with like this much. And, if you're a woman, you walk in with like, this much, and it kind of goes down and down and down, right? So what you have to do in a sense is walk into the newsroom and start to accumulate some of that. And the way you accumulate that influence is by doing your job extraordinarily well. There's always this whole thing about, people who are parts of minority groups, we just have to, we're expected to perform at a higher level unless we perform at a higher level. Well, what I say is, okay, that's tragic and it's unfair, but perform at a higher level. Come in, work harder, get in earlier, leave later, come up with more ideas, make sure that those ideas are fully baked. Don't come up to a news desk and start complaining about the coverage of a story that you can't participate in, that you can't contribute to. Because if you walk up and you say, okay, all these big guns are covering the story and they're missing the Black point of view, they're going to look at you and say, Junior, what do you know? You have not even covered a story of this magnitude before. So go and accumulate some of that clout. And then after you've broken a couple of things, you can come up and you say, you know what, on that big story, I think I have something to contribute. And this is what I have to contribute. And it's not just an opinion or a criticism. It's a source. It's an idea. I've been out there. I've made some phone calls. I know something you don't know that's of value. And that's going to draw more readers or viewers.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Let's see. What questions we might have here. So one thing the students ask a lot about, and I see some sentiment around that here, is, you may not want to move on to a big station. You may not want to move on to a big town. So, the guy from Harvard, he's punching the clock so he can get out. But is there value perhaps in sticking around with a slightly smaller market and staying and just kind of working your way up so you can have the influence?
Yeah. I think absolutely. And listen, I think it's really important to understand what the definition of success is. Everybody's definition is different. And also everybody's definition changes over time. So sometimes it's, I really want to be the best reporter here in Youngstown, Ohio, or I really want to be the best reporter. I want to make it to LA, or I want to be in New York City, or I want to run my own production company, or I really only want to do documentaries. And do not be influenced. And it's very easy to do when you're in college, because you'll see all your friends getting jobs and doing things. I remember I had friends who were working on air, and I was basically fetching people coffee and French fries, and just, it was hard to not compare yourself to what they were able to do when you were doing something different that I wasn't sure I was on the right path for me, but I wasn't sure I was on the right path for me. So I think it's really, really key not to confuse that with this, what somebody else's definition of success is. So for sure. And I think sometimes the Harvard guy wants to, or whoever wants to, I don't know what his definition of success is. Maybe he wants to be in a small town, be near his parents, good for him. Everybody should get to do what they want to do. The key is, though, I think, as Rose was pointing out, influence is about a little bit about time served, right? It's about being there, showing up, doing the work, understanding how things work, not pitching. What one thing you see a lot of is people saying, oh, I hate this idea. You're like, right, but we're 4 minutes away from air. So you don't get to hate this idea. You get to hate this idea the night before when we can make it better. You don't get to hate this idea 4 minutes before I have to go on air with this idea. That's just being a good citizen in the newsroom. How do you pitch stories? Who do you talk to? You'll learn all of those things in a newsroom. Who really is the power center? If there's a good idea, who needs to hear it? The show producer, the executive producer, the anchor that you like. Those are all different paths to getting a story on the air, and every place is a little bit different. So it's really about understanding the system, and staying where you are often helps you understand a system really, really well. The woman who's our executive producer for the listening tour and was my executive producer at Matter of Fact till she got moved over to the listening tour when that thing took off. She's been at her stations for, what do you think, Rose, 40 years?
Long time.
WYSN, forever, literally. And she is so beloved. When she picks up the phone and says, hi, Bob, can you do me a favor? Everyone, it's like magic. Doors pop open for her, right? Because she has so much clout and so much ability just to get stuff done. It's like watching magic unfold. And she wanted to live in Wisconsin, and that's where she is. And that's where she never wanted to be anywhere else. So that's where she is right now. So I fully understand that. And I've had a lot of experience with that.
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is you don't want people to write you off, so don't write them off. Most people are in a predominantly male newsroom or predominantly white newsroom, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that all these people are your enemy or can't understand you or don't understand what you're trying to do or don't care about, what happened to a George Floyd, or even don't understand what happened to George Floyd, because everybody comes from their own experiences, right? And, white people can be poor. In fact, there are more white people than any other group in this country, right? And people come from a Jewish background or Catholic background, and they have immigrant parents, and they have other experiences. And it's important to remember that as you walk through the newsroom and make assumptions. And I think particularly one of the assumptions that is made most often is age. I think that, we write off people because they're getting older. I mean, the woman that Soledad is talking about, she's older than both of us, and she's one of the smartest people in the industry. And people start to look at you and say, oh, well, you're disappearing, or you're not relevant, or whatever. And that person in the newsroom, that, old guy on the rewrite desk and the stereotype of the old newspaper, he may be the person that the young, new African-American woman could learn a heck of a lot from if she came up to him and said, I hear you are the best writer at this newspaper. I think your stuff is amazing, and anything you can teach me is much appreciated. And if they invest in you, if they feel like, they have an affinity there, they can help you. They can introduce you into the power brokers.
Oh, that is so true. I know in my background at the Washington Post and at the Charlotte Observer, those guys who've been there for years and years, you just sit next to them, you learn so much from them. You have to open your ears and your heart and be willing to, like you said, not assume things about people.
Oh yeah, and they can, people can really help you. You need mentors. I mean, I'll tell you a quick little story. The first sort of big newspaper I worked for was the New York Daily News, which is a tabloid of much, renown. And I was, very young. I was only like, I guess, 2 years out of college at that point. And I went on a story, and it was about a murder. And Jimmy Breslin was there, who's this, famous old-time columnist. He's now passed away, but he wrote a ton of books, and he was kind of one of the original great columnists. And we were covering the same story, and he was doing this column, and I did a little feature piece, and they basically sent me to talk to all the people of color in the neighborhood because they were too afraid to do that because it was the crack epidemic and it was all dangerous. So they sent this young woman of color out there. So I wrote a piece about what all these people thought about their neighborhood being torn apart. And so Jimmy walks into the newsroom the next day when it's in the newspaper and announces that I am the most talented young person to walk through this door. More talented than, he said, all these white guys sitting around there for their Ivy League degrees, and kind of thing, and said it to everyone. And from then on, I had like 2 months of real influence. Like everybody wanted to assign me something. And he just anointed me because he thought I did a good job. And I had told him what I'd gotten that day. I'd showed him my quotes. And I said, how do you think I should put these together? If you don't mind telling me, because you're this great columnist. And he was pleased as punch. for the compliment. And he looked at my stuff and he's like, wow, she got all these people to talk to her.
Good for you. Good for you. Well, we have one student, Justin. Thanks for your question. For Soledad, do you struggle with having a large platform and using it to speak for others who can't, and try not to possibly lose your job like Jemele Hill and ESPN? Or is it something that you feel obligated to do?
I wouldn't say having a large platform is a struggle in that way. Managing it sometimes can be a bit of a struggle because it is a little bit like feeding the beast, and you constantly have to be on top of what's happening. And we have a lot of projects, so we're doing a lot of promotions. So no, because I run my own production company, everything I do from a contractual point of view is non-exclusive. And so everyone gets me as I am. You get me with my Instagram and my Twitter and whatever. So, and that's a little bit different than most people who go and work for a company and then the company says, here's a big stack of our rules around social media. You can say this, you can't say this, you shouldn't say this. We fired the last person who did this. So I always advise, especially young people, be really, really clear in understanding what the rules of your organization's social media are. I mean, Jemele was fired. I thought what she was saying was very accurate, but what they were able to say is, we have rules here and you have violated those rules. And so I think it's really important to make sure that if you're working for a company, I work for a company called Soledad O'Brien Presents. So like I wrote the rules.
But I work for Soledad O'Brien herself. So the only way I'm gonna get fired is if I say something super stupid at this panel.
Exactly. And so that makes a big difference, right? So being self-employed gives you a certain amount of ability to do what you want. But I would say for every single student here, you have to really, really, really think about monitoring your social media. I am old and I have been at this game a long time, and I have written books about my life, and I'm a known quantity. But I think if you're young and you're trying to establish yourself in this business, I love using my platform to stick up for people. I also like that my platform, because I have so many followers, I'm able to say something or support somebody and say, hey, this is a great story or a great thread or a great person, or you should check this out. And it gives it a lot of extra oomph because I have so many followers. So those are the things that I certainly enjoy. I don't think that strategy is for everybody.
Okay. And Rose, maybe you can take this one from Lilia. What's the biggest challenge you faced in your career? Or both of you, if you could respond, and what did you learn from that experience?
I think probably the biggest challenge I faced is covering a story where it affected me personally and my neighborhood personally. And I don't mean me personally as in I was emotionally affected, because I'm emotionally affected by a lot of stories on a weekly basis. I mean, so many horrible things have been happening. But I'd say September 11th and working in war zones where you were part of the story in the sense that you were threatened. And for instance, I remember on September 11th, as I was down at Ground Zero as the attacks were happening, and I was live on CNN because I was one of the few people for CNN that was already downtown and had a cell phone line. And the two phone calls that I got that were not from my desk were both from good friends asking me what was happening because their relatives were in the building. Both of them, one lost her mother and the other lost her husband. And I was looking at the building and I was thinking, the only honest answer I can give you is they're probably dead, but I'm not going to say that because I don't know. So that was a struggle because you're part of the story. And I think that happens actually more often than people realize, when you're out there covering it, and there's no real easy answer to how you do it other than remember why you're there.
Yes, indeed. Soledad?
Yeah, I think anytime you have to manage somebody's tragedy, right? It's and keep your focus on telling the story and not and always keeping center of mind that you're not the story, right? So making sure that you're constantly elevating the people around you and navigating through difficult stories that are emotional. So, I went to cover Hurricane Katrina. And trying to figure out, I remember people yelling at us, can you match this reporting? Can you do that? We were just reporting what we would see ahead of us. And you're dealing with people who are so traumatized and so devastated. It was a very emotionally difficult thing to do. The Haiti earthquake, the tsunami, when people would tell you about their children who were missing, who, washed out of their hands, and they'd sort of beg you as they were sobbing to help, could you help find their baby who had floated away in a tsunami? And you're thinking, I know this is not a thing, right? This is not going to be possible. And yet, how do I help this person bring their story to the greater public? Because maybe somebody can help them.
Right. Another question, Stefano. To what extent do you believe white fragility has hindered our ability to cover issues relating to race?
I don't know that I would say it's white fragility that's hindering those issues. I think it's much more of a sense that there's only one POV that matters, right? So that it reminds me of when we would go out and do man on the street interviews. Very typical to run around and interview people on the street and come back with a whole reel full of white people that you bumped into at CNN. It was right outside of our building in Midtown. But if I had gone out and only interviewed Black people, or only interviewed, let's say everybody I interviewed was Chinese, right? Someone would say to me, oh my God, Soledad, you got 17 Chinese people. Like, you need to go out again and do this, but not recognizing that every day this is what they do, that they're, what feels perfectly good to them is not particularly diverse at all. And that's sort of this idea of point of view. So I think that the ability to cover issues around race requires an understanding of history, of being able to push back on lying political figures, being able to dig out stories and book people who are really knowledgeable and thoughtful and have interesting things to say. And so I think that's much more of a sense of, I didn't even know it was a story, more than white fragility.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Taiwo asked, what was the toughest aspect about creating your own production company?
Oh my gosh. So Taiwo, how much time do you have? Number one, I knew nothing about running a production company. I knew nothing about management. I have never taken a class in accounting. I had no idea how to do a business plan. I had all my stuff on my dining room table while I tried to figure out, where we would house the production company and how big. I remember looking at spaces in New York City, and people would say, well, how much space do you need? I'm like, I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know how big it's going to be. And I knew the stories I wanted to tell, but I didn't know all those things around how do you run a company? And really at the end of the day, right, it's all about hiring good people, setting them loose on the world to do a great job. But at the very beginning, it was very stressful because I knew how to do well what I knew how to do. But I had to hire for things that I really wasn't sure how to do. I had to have a finance person. I had to hire people in development. I had to hire editors. I had to hire photographers. I had to hire managers and people who would tell us, are these stories on track? I had to hire people who could help me pitch the stories. So there's just so much that I didn't know. The good news was so many people were willing to be helpful, even to the point of like drawing a little picture of the structure of their own company on a napkin for me. And so I think probably the biggest obstacle was, what does your company look like in your head? What are you doing? And we've ended up having sort of 4 verticals where we do documentaries and journalism reporting, which Rose is in charge of all of that, where I do a lot of speaking and what I would just call talent stuff. So if I'm reporting for HBO, that's another vertical. We have a whole other division that just does pitches for other networks, not news networks. So we have a number of series. One is airing on BET right now called Disrupt and Dismantle. We just sold another one to OWN. We've got another one that's on Discovery Plus that is a look at a murder of a young man and why the other young man who committed the murder is not sitting in prison right now. And so that's run by somebody else. And then our 4th vertical is really, we do a lot of branded content. So we're hired as a company, not me personally, but we're hired as a company to do storytelling for brands. But that took a little while to figure out like what we wanted this company to look like.
Mm-hmm. When did you start and when did you kind of hit your stride? I'm sorry, Soledad.
2013 we launched. So I'd say probably probably on our way to 2015. Probably took a solid year and a half. So maybe the beginning of 2015, because I launched in the middle of 2013.
Okay.
And I know, I go walk around a big space and ask yourself, so how many square feet do you need in New York City to do this idea that you have? And by the way, it's an empty space. It has nothing in it at all. Like, what should it look like? How do you do that? How do you make that happen? I mean, I look back now very fondly because I learned a lot, but there were some days that I would literally pray, could today not be a day when I learn anything? Could I just get through the day? Remember when someone said, so how about your quarterly taxes? I'm like, what are quarterly taxes? I don't pay taxes. Hi, yes, well, we discovered that pretty fast. Stuff like that. Every day you were discovering something new. And then about a year and a half in, you realize, okay, I think we figured it out.
As someone who's working on a startup, in addition to what I do, today, people were talking about cap tables, and it's like, what's that?
You note to self, have someone explain that to me.
Exactly. Rose, what about for you?
I was going to say, it's really interesting when the tables are turned, isn't it? Because you have all this long career of criticizing people for doing all sorts of things as managers. And then suddenly somebody makes you the manager and you're like, oh boy, now what do I do? And, there's a lot of things just over the course of a career. Like, I can't find any diverse people to hire, because I guess there's just so much discrimination out there that there aren't any talented young Black folks. So it's hard to be diverse, right? So then you go into, this company and start to hire people, and you have this in your head and you think to yourself, oh my God, we have this company. We want to be diverse. We're going to do diverse stories. Where are we going to find these people? And then you realize there are all these talented, diverse people out there. These companies just don't want to hire them.
That's the biggest upside, honestly, to be able to hire people, to be able to give someone a job is the greatest thing that feel like I'm able to do. I love hiring people. I love to be able to take somebody and say, I have a job for you. I have an opportunity for you. Now go knock this out of the park. I love that. And as Rose says, to be able to say, and all of you are Black people in this. Okay. All of you are Native people in this, or on this one, we're going to have, I love it. I love that we have a very diverse team, very intentionally, same as our show. And that, we set out to do it and we do it, which proves that, if I'm doing it in my little itty bitty company, certainly big organizations could do a much better job.
Exactly. I remember when I was starting BET.com, the number of Black people who were doing, kind of online journalism in 1999, very few. You create your own if you can't find them. You get smart people and you teach them how to do online, and we were fine after that. So it's really interesting. We have about 8 more minutes. One other question, Justin, again, as the industry is constantly evolving, what advice do you have for young journalists trying to stay on top of the game? I'm gonna throw that one to you, Rose.
Be good at what you do. Honestly, I think, look, as you're young and going into the industry, there are new skill sets all the time. I get people all the time who say to me, do I need to learn Pro Tools? And I think to myself, oh my gosh, how does Pro Tools work? Or should I do Avid? Or should I do Premiere? Or should I do Final Cut Pro? And I'm like, ask an editor, right? But young people are required to have a huge set of technical skills these days. They are one of the requirements of the job. And I got to tell you right now, I can't imagine our company hiring somebody that didn't have those technical skills, because you need to have them. And because those of us who kind of came up in the profession before that stuff don't have them in such a refined way, it's harder for us to keep up because we've sort of moved into the next thing. So not only do you have to have that, but you do have to be damn good at your job. And I think that if you're a terrific reporter, people take notice of that. There's got to be some substance to what you're showing. So when people come to me with a college resume and they say, I haven't really done anything, I say to them, have you done as much as you can with the opportunities you've been given? Because I would rather somebody show me a resume full of really incredible short documentaries they did for a class than nothing that they have done.
But Rose, can I add on to that? Because I think, when people tell me they're interested in being on TV, and I'm like, so I know you have an iPhone. Why are you not shooting 2-minute pieces 3 times a week? Don't tell me that you have this interest and you're not even able to make up a show, Dogs in the Park, where you do a 2.5-minute segment every, 3 times a week about various dogs you bump into in the park. By the way, that would be a home run on Instagram. So feel free to steal my idea. My dog Coco has more fans and followers than I do. And by the way, imagine then when you're being interviewed, you say to somebody, well, actually, I've started this thing kind of as a lark and it's gone really well. And here's what I've learned by actually doing of it. I've learned how to shoot better. I've gotten better at editing. Everybody likes this kind of editing system, but I'm actually good at these too, because I really like the other one better. Now you're having a conversation in a professional way with the people who are looking at hiring someone for a job. I know when we're looking at people to talk to someone about a project they love, something that they worked on, something they volunteered on, a documentary that they got to be part of. Those things really count for a lot. So I wouldn't assume like, well, I'm a student, I can't get a job. Why, if you're interested in podcasting, you should be doing a podcast right now. You can do a show. You can do your own newspaper. There's so much that you can do to show people. I don't actually officially have a job, but I've actually been doing this for 2 years. And by the way, you will learn so much that the conversation you're having about being hired is going to be so much better than other conversations that people are having about, well, I see your GPA was a 3.2. Tell me about your interests. You're going to say, what was so interesting? Here's something I got stuck on, or journalistically, this was what, I didn't know this person, I interviewed them. They didn't want to be on, on camera. How did I handle that? Now you're having real conversations versus just, I think the kind of conversation everybody usually has.
Don't be afraid to compete. Don't be afraid of people who have a better, or shinier degree than you have from a supposedly better school, or whose father is the publisher of this or whatever. And, one of the most talented, if not the most talented person that came across the transom for Soledad and I was a young woman named Sarah Mahmood, who walked up to me. I did like a high school conferences speech where you talked about your career. And this kid was maybe 16, 17 years old. And she raises her hand about 10 times and came up to me afterwards and said, is there a place for me, do you think, at CNN to be an intern, or could I help you with anything? And I was like, yeah. And she's one of 12 people to ask this question at this forum. And she said, listen, I go to a high school that doesn't have any media at all. We don't have any media classes. It's huge. It's overcrowded. We have no newspaper. We have no anything at the school. But I wrote a bunch of stories. And she hands me a stack of paper and says, these are the stories I wrote. And we sort of self-published them. We did like our own little newspaper and we handed out in the hallways, right? And so I took these and I read them on the subway on the way back to the office. I thought, this girl can write and she can report. Let's bring her on board. And I actually Googled her the other day because we sort of starting to lose touch with her. She went to Stanford Law School. She was one of the lead investigators on the Russian interference in the election. Her expertise is gerrymandering and election fraud. She represents asylum seekers. And she has on her resume something like, I was previously a journalist before I decided to move on to law, blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, wow, you really made something of yourself. And, she worked with us for years.
We brought her in at CNN. And one day the president of CNN, she was a high schooler. President of CNN says, so where are you in school? And she says something like,
Flushing High School.
Billy Bob High School. Yeah. And he says, we don't take high schoolers here. I said, well, we are moving right along. We have nothing else to say. But she was the first high schooler to be an intern at CNN.
Unafraid. That was her answer. She was unafraid.
That's great. That's great. Well, we only have a couple more minutes and I wanted to thank you all, but I also wanted to ask you, what is a story you can't wait to do next? I mean, when you lie awake at night or you're walking down the street, walking your Coco, what story just enters your mind? Like, I can't wait to get on that story. Something that's
so many. Well, I'll do one as a pitch for something that we're actually going to do as a story, because when I heard it originally, I was like, I must do this. It's a great story. A story of a guy who mailed himself out of prison. He worked in the prison, the area of the prison where they fixed mail bags in Louisiana. And he was able to stick himself inside all these wrapped up mail bags on a pallet, which they then brought out of the prison grounds, and he was able to escape and be on the lam for 18 months. It's the most remarkable story ever. Today, he sits in Supermax, so it does not end well for him. But it's a really incredible story. And by the way, he shot lots of video every step of the way and kept a record of where he was going, learned to hack into various computers so that he could keep up with the investigation of where he was, and often weigh in on how the investigators were doing. It's a crazy, crazy story. And so we're really looking forward to telling that story.
That's great. That's great. It sounds like the start of a movie where then the FBI comes and hires him to be the super hacker, escapee guy.
Yeah, I think he's still at the stage of being stuck at Supermax, and no one's coming to hire him for anything right now.
Right. Well, this has been a great conversation. And Soledad and Rose, thank you so much for spending time with the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and our students. And I'm sure you'll be hearing from many of them applying for whatever internships that you have available. And thank you so much for doing what you do so well. And can't wait to see the new listening tour and some of the other programs that you're putting on.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. All righty.